I've been a huge admirer of Brendan O'Neill's for many years. Here's a bloke just like myself who's almost stupid enough to go on TV and argue with the Ramona elites. You've been doing it for years now, the Yasmin Alibaya Browns, the sort of people that I love to argue with as well. You're a master at it, Brendan. Superb. You've kept loads of us sane on the Sky News paper review over the years. And of course, Spiked is a bright burning torch of free speech and liberty. And you are at the helm of the online operation. We are so happy to have you on the show. Seriously, mate, thank you. It means a lot. So I want to talk about your political background. I mean, I'm an old lefty. You're an old lefty. Claire Fox was an old lefty. One of the great things about the Brexit Party was the fact we were a marriage of left and right and centre, which kind of obliterated that kind of far right extremist nonsense. But as somebody from the left, Brendan, what is it in particular that drew you towards Brexit, and what made you become a champion of it?
Well, you know, in this country, there is actually a very fine tradition of left-wing Euroscepticism. I mean, it was really personified in people like Tony Benn, Barbara Castle, Peter Shaw, and, you know, numerous Labour activists, trade union leaders. I mean, these were the people who were the most Eurosceptic in the 70s and the 80s. And it's a very good tradition. But one of the most fascinating things that's happened in British political life over the past 20 or 30 years has been the slow, long death of left-wing Euroscepticism. I find it really depressing, really revealing as well. And I think what's essentially happened is that the left has lost faith in ordinary people. It's lost faith in working class people. It now trusts bureaucracy and technocracy more than it trusts its own fellow citizens. And as a consequence of that, it became pro-EU. It saw the EU as a sensible institution, a pacifying institution, a good place where we could outsource lawmaking and politics away from the grubby, stupid, racist masses. So I think the death of left-wing Euroscepticism really tells us an important story about what's happened to the left itself. But for me, as someone who comes from the left, my view is that if the left is not about democracy, then it's not about anything at all. I mean, the left came into existence precisely in order to give a voice to ordinary people who were usually shut out of political debate, to really kind of intrude on political life with the voices of working men, working women, people who are struggling. And that's really, I think, the spirit of democracy, allowing the man in the street, the woman in the street to have their say on political issues. The left has now turned its back on that and now treats those people with contempt. And I think that is really, really sad.
What do you think has made the left mistrust the people with democracy? It's as if they don't trust them with the vote anymore. And what was the change? What spurred them on to feel like that about their own electorate, their own voter base?
You know, the left is just so disappointed with ordinary people. It really does look upon them as stupid. You know, they read The Sun, they read the Daily Mail, they hold unfashionable points of view. You know, they're not necessarily au fait with the cult of gender fluidity or all the new language around identity politics and all these things that you're supposed to be good at if you are a decent person and you want to be a member of polite society. I think a lot of the left looks with almost aristocratic horror upon ordinary people. It sees them as this swarming, obese mass, you know, brainwashed by the Daily Mail, brainwashed by people like Anne Widdecombe. It sees them as being kind of this stupid mass of people who've been led astray by demagogues, which of course is completely and utterly untrue. Anyone, like you were saying, Martin, anyone who has spent any time engaging with these people will know that they are incredibly intelligent, well, more than capable of thinking for themselves. And the thing that struck me over the past 4 years, I did various speeches around the country about why people should support Brexit, why they should support a so-called hard Brexit. And when I met people up and down the country, I was really struck that they knew far more about the European Union than the chattering classes in London did. And you'd go to a dinner party in London or a media event in London, and it was very clear that the Ramona types you always bumped into didn't know anything about the European Union. They didn't know how it worked. They didn't know what it had done to the people of France and Netherlands and Greece when they dared to vote against EU constitutions. They didn't know that it had overridden the votes of the Irish people when they voted against the Nice Treaty in 2001 and the Lisbon Treaty in 2008. They just didn't know this stuff. They were completely clueless. Whereas when I was in Leeds and Manchester and other parts of the country, I met numerous people who don't have newspaper columns and who don't get on TV, who were incredibly well informed about the European Union and about how destructive the European Union has been. And that to me is democracy in action. Ordinary people taking responsibility for the future of the nation, using their brains and deciding that the nation needs to go in a different direction. And that's the thing that most excited me about the vote for Brexit.
You know, there are so many bombs there. There's so many truth bombs to unpick. It's hard to know where to start. We could talk for about in the next day. But there's some things I'd really like to pick on, and it's so true. Really early on, anybody who was outside of the M25 and was talking to people at car boot sales, at chip shops, in pubs, they understood that this was coming. And when we spent our entire summer interviewing candidates, PPCs for the Brexit Party, the people that were coming through those doors were cab drivers. They were self-taught political experts, and they absolutely knew what they were voting for.
Yeah.
And all this crap, sorry, that's another swear word, Anne, all this stuff that we got in the media about they were illiterate, kind of backward, they didn't know what they were voting for, was so wrong. Now, I want to pick up particularly about the media here, Brendan. You were fighting that wicket, that lonely wicket for all that time. So was I. The disconnect from the media elite and the public is so huge. None of them saw it coming. I think you and I were probably, and Julie Hartley-Brewer maybe, were like the only journalists who predicted Brexit based on common sense and actual talk to people. Why did the media get it so wrong? Where does this come from?
That's a fascinating question, and the disconnect between the media classes and ordinary people is completely vast. It is a chasm-sized disconnect. The moment I realised that Brexit was going to happen, I was in Stoke-on-Trent doing Any Questions on Radio 4, I think about 2 or 3 months before the referendum. And whenever I've done Any Questions before, the audience is always really hostile to me because I believe in old-fashioned things like freedom of speech and democracy. But in Stoke-on-Trent, the number of people in the audience, and these were school teachers, cab drivers, plumbers, decent people from that part of the country, the number of them who came up to me at the end and said, I cannot wait to vote Leave. And I was completely blown away because unfortunately, I have a tendency to be in a bit of a bubble myself. I live in London. I move in certain kind of circles, and sometimes you can lose sight of what's going on in the country. But it was at that moment that I realized that it was distinctly possible and likely that Brexit would happen. And the media were getting it wrong time and time again. And that's because, if you look at, for example, the media coverage of certain places in Wales after the referendum, when people voted Leave, there were some news reports in the media saying, why are these idiots in Wales and Northern England voting against the European Union when the European Union has funded, I don't know, a new gallery in their local town or a new bridge or something like that? And they genuinely thought that ordinary people should be grateful for this kind of feudalistic largesse from the European Union, the fact that it was throwing them a few crumbs from the table. Whereas if you spoke to any of those people, you would realize that in their workplaces, in their homes, on the streets, in the pub, they were having serious political conversations about democracy, about sovereignty. And I did a talk in Leeds, and I went to the pub after I did this talk in Leeds about Brexit, and there was graffiti in the pub toilet. Maybe Anne will disapprove of graffiti, I'm sure, but there was graffiti in the pub toilet saying something along the lines of, we voted Brexit, get us the hell out of the European Union. This was in a pub in Leeds. You wouldn't see that in London. You wouldn't see that in most of the places people like us move in. So that chasm-sized disconnect between ordinary people who believe in themselves, believe in their communities, and believe in this country, and the media classes who are fashionably anti-British, fashionably nihilistic, and think everything this country does is terrible, that divide is huge. And I think it's getting larger and larger all the time.
I absolutely agree, and I was privileged to be voted as the MEP for the West Midlands. I spent a lot of time in places like Stoke. 69%, voted to leave, and Stoke was where the Guardian sent a journalist to knock on doors before the referendum, and it was on the front page of the Guardian about a week before the referendum. And they were absolutely flabbergasted that every single door they were knocking on was saying we're voting to leave. They literally did not see it coming. Yeah. Polly Toynbee at the Guardian got into a flap. She went straight into a tailspin of racism and bigotry and xenophobia, and they've all been conned. They did not see it coming. They were so myopic. It's unbelievable. Even now, I find it hard to get my head around. Brendan, the comments are coming in on Facebook. Brendan is spot on. Roll on January the 1st. Everyone is loving you on Facebook tonight. Belinda, next question.
So I was going to ask Brendan, if Brexit is continuously delayed and the can is kicked down the road again and again and again, what do you think this means for democracy, number one? And number two, is supranational governance inevitable? If even Brexit doesn't get implemented after 3-4 times we voted for it, if it's still, even at the very end, it doesn't get implemented and we're not free of the institutions, is supranational governance inevitable? Should we all just lay our weapons down?
I think if Brexit doesn't happen properly and in a real way, which means removing ourselves from all forms of European Union jurisdiction in relation to the single market, the customs union and the ECJ, if that doesn't happen, then I think it will be a betrayal of what people voted for. And I think it will be devastating to democracy in this country. We're living through a real crunch moment in British politics where we have the largest democratic bloc in the history of this country, the 17.4 million of us who voted to radically transform how politics are done in this country, to remove ourselves from the EU and to return to a more democratic form of politics. This, in my view, was a ballot box revolt against the elites. And if the elites betray it, I think we're going to head into incredibly choppy waters. In relation to the democracy question, some of my heroes are the Chartists. The Chartists in the 1840s, of course, struggled for the right of working class men to vote. And in their newspaper, they had this front page editorial once, which said, look, we're not saying that ordinary men are just as good at political decision making as lords and ladies and priests and everyone else. We're saying they're better. And the reason they're better is that they live in society in a way that those people often don't. They have to understand the difficulties in society, how to struggle on a low wage, what it means to go to work every day. They understand the troubles facing the country better than these aloof sections of society do. And I think that's become more true over time. We're no longer ruled by lords, ladies, and priests, but we are ruled by these new upper middle class technocrats who are as cut off from ordinary people as any of those old aristocratic elites were. And what Brexit represented was an effort by ordinary people to say, we want to bring politics back down to our level because we're good at it. We can make these decisions. We understand what's going on in society. And that was a revolt against supranational governance because people recognize that these globalist institutions like the European Union are entirely about outsourcing our democratic rights to unaccountable institutions and unaccountable commissioners. And this wasn't people voting because they're xenophobic or nostalgic for empire or little Englanders. This was people saying very clearly, we want our decision-making powers back. And we think we should decide the future of this country, not some commissioner in the EU that we've never heard of. And if that isn't adhered to, if Boris Johnson doesn't make that a reality, we're in trouble.
I agree entirely. My gosh. Well, we've had a wonderful, we keep getting so many messages while you're on. We've had one from Julie on Facebook who said Barnsley voted to leave we want out. So I do still think there's energy behind it. And, you know, God help the Tories if they don't follow through, if they try and con us. It's the conning that I think the public hate as well. Just be honest. If you're going to let us down, just be honest about it. If we find out we're conned again, I sadly don't think people will vote again. And that's the big crisis in democracy, is people just stop voting.
Yeah, there's a terrible, terrible danger of a political withdrawal. That the sense of ennui is the problem. But I think, you know, with the right people, hopefully we can re-energize. And that's why I say to you, Herr Widdecombe, don't lay down your musket just yet. Because I think with the right people, and Brandon, have you ever thought about getting into politics? You're amazing, mate. Have you ever thought about getting involved?
No, not for me. I prefer being ever so slightly under the radar. I prefer commentating and winding people up on television. I leave politics to braver people like Anne and Ben. I like to be slightly behind the scenes.
Well, your trouble is you're too sensible. You're too sensible. You'd rather wind people in real life.
Very wise.
On the TV. Now then, I want before we get to your scores on the doors, we're keeping a chart, as we know so far, a 0 and a 2. It's not looking good. I want to talk about a couple of other important things with you, and that is this obsession with Build Back Better and the new Green Deal, whereas actually the 80-seat majority that Boris Johnson was resolutely delivered on a mandate of get Brexit done. We ran a poll on Unlocked this week, and I said, what's the most important to you? Get Brexit done, Build Back Better, or the new Green Deal? 94% said get Brexit done. 3% the environment, 3% Build Back Better, whatever it even means. Why is it that in a time of a single mandate, you were elected to do this, Boris is banging on about this tree-hugging nonsense?
I think there's been a woke coup in Downing Street. I really do. I think, you know, the so-called Brexit bad boys are out, Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane, and this kind of, you know, posh woke girl circle seems to be in control. Allegra Stratton and Carrie Symonds, of course, Boris's girlfriend. But the point is, I don't want to demonize those two women, because the key point is that the problem is Boris. And the problem, I think, is that Boris is drifting away from the people who swept him to power, which in no small part were the people of the Red Wall areas. These are not woke people. These are not politically correct people. These are not people who obsess over climate change alarmist issues. These are not Guardianistas. These are people who believe in democracy, believe in sovereignty, believe in community, and are concerned about the jobs and the economy. Those are the people Boris Johnson and his cabinet need to be listening to, not some privately educated woman who gets a job in Downing Street and who obsesses about things like climate change and gender fluidity. So we cannot allow politics to go back to the elite consensus opinion that it was built around over the past few years, because Brexit was about breaking free of that. So I think Boris is failing. And I think Boris is bottling out of the culture wars. He's bottling out of these pressing questions about British history, freedom of speech, democracy, and so on. He hasn't got the stomach for that fight. And I think we need a leader who has got the stomach for that fight and who is willing to stand up for British traditions and British history and for values like freedom of speech and democracy. On all those fronts at the moment, Boris is failing. And the people of the Red Wall areas, you've said this, Martin, constantly, they're not stupid. They understand politics and they are clocking all of this and they are watching Boris make mistakes. And I think he's in trouble at the next election if he doesn't turn around soon.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, just to reiterate, you know, our experience was hard won, you know, during a European election campaign and during a really tough general election campaign where it rained for 3 weeks solidly.
It was brutal. We were hated from all sides, from the Tories, from the Remainers. Yeah. We were just, it was hard.
But I'll tell you what, just to echo your point, Brenda, you're absolutely correct. I must have knocked on about 4,000 doors between me and my team. And we asked all of those people, what are the issues that concern you locally and nationally? Literally nobody from the blue corner was talking about the environment. Literally nobody. It just didn't happen. It was important to them, but it was about the 8th or the 9th thing. They wanted Brexit done. They wanted Corbyn out. They wanted jobs. They wanted economic security. And this is even before the COVID lockdown. I think the Tories are completely losing the plot on this environmental nonsense. It feels to me like we voted for Boris Johnson and we got Caroline Lucas in number 10. It really does. Brendan O'Neill, over to you, sir. What's your message for Boris Johnson?
Trust the British people. They understand this country and they love this country far more than suits in Brussels do. And they are more trustworthy than anyone in the European Union. Trust them, listen to them, and leave the EU fully and properly.